Millionaire CEO announces he's engaged to a barista to get out of an arranged marriage, and her next move shocked everyone. Julian Vance, CEO of Vance Global, felt the air in the boardroom growing thinner with every passing second. His father, Robert Vance, a titan of the old guard with eyes of steel and the patience of a predator, was about to make his final move. "The proposal is on the table, Julian," Robert said, his voice echoing in the mahogany-paneled room. "The merger with Sterling Industries will make us the largest force in the sector. The board approves. The shareholders are clamoring for it. There is only one condition." Julian knew the condition. He had been dodging it for 6 months, using every excuse in the book, from market volatility to needing more time for due diligence. But he had run out of road. "The marriage," he stated, the words leaving his mouth with the taste of ash. "The union of the families," Robert corrected, his voice sharp and dismissive of his son's distaste. "You and Isabella Sterling. It's a good match. She's educated, of her stock, she understands our world. It is the most intelligent move to solidify this agreement. The ceremony will be in December." A wave of cold fury washed over Julian. They weren't asking, they were informing. His life, his future, reduced to a single clause in a merger contract. He needed a way out, an escape route, anything. His mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, a delay, a reason to push back against the inevitable. He felt the walls of his perfectly curated life closing in, the pressure of his father's legacy weighing down on him like a physical force. His gaze wandered, desperate for a distraction, and landed on the giant projection screen on the wall. It was currently displaying the website of a business magazine, an article he was supposed to have read before the meeting. The main story was about the resilience of local economies. And there she was, a photograph of a woman smiling from behind the counter of a coffee shop. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun. A dusting of what looked like flour was on her cheek, and her eyes sparkled with a life and warmth that felt like they belonged to another planet compared to the sterile coldness of the boardroom. The name of the coffee shop was painted on a quaint wooden sign behind her, Lena's Corner. It was an impulse, an act of pure, unadulterated desperation and rebellion. A lightning strike of an idea in a mind that was used to calculated, long-term strategies. Julian grabbed the remote from the table, the cool plastic a stark contrast to his clammy palm. With a few clicks, he zoomed in on the image, projecting the smiling woman's face for the entire room to see. Then he stood up. "I'm sorry, Father. I'm sorry to all of you," he announced, his voice ringing out with a manufactured confidence he didn't feel. "But this merger, under these conditions, is impossible." Robert Vance's eyes narrowed to slits. And why would that be? Julian pointed a steady hand toward the screen, toward the woman who had no idea she was about to become the centerpiece of a corporate bombshell. "Because I'm already engaged. To her." The silence that fell over the room was so absolute you could hear a pin drop on the plush carpet. The board members, a collection of seasoned, unflappable men and women, stared from the photo to Julian, their mouths slightly agape, his father's face transformed, the calm superiority cracking to reveal a mask of contained rage. In that moment, Julian Vance had no idea who Lena was, where her coffee shop was located, or how he was going to explain the fact that his supposed fiancée had absolutely no clue that he even existed. All he knew was that he had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of his own life, and for some terrifying, liberating reason, it felt like a relief. 2 hours later, Julian walked into Lena's Corner. The place was small, cozy, and smelled of freshly ground coffee and cinnamon buns. It was a world away from his usual haunts of glass and steel. Lena was behind the counter, serving a customer with the same genuine smile from the photograph. He waited, feeling absurdly out of place in his $5,000 suit. As the customer left, he approached the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never did during multi-million-dollar negotiations. "Lena?" he asked, his voice a little hoarse. She turned, her warm brown eyes sizing him up with an amused curiosity. "That's me. What can I get for you? Double espresso to save you from a boring meeting?" "Something a little more complicated," Julian said, sliding a sleek leather portfolio onto the worn wooden counter. "I have a proposal for you." Lena eyed the portfolio, then looked back at him, a sarcastic smirk playing on her lips. "Let me guess. You want to buy my coffee shop to build another soulless skyscraper?" "No, I want you to pretend to be my fiancé," he said, deciding that directness was the only path forward. Lena blinked once, then twice, then she threw her head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh that made the only other customer in the shop, an old man reading a newspaper, look up over his glass. "That's a new one. Are you on some kind of hidden camera show?" "It's a business proposition," Julian insisted, his cheeks warming slightly. He wasn't used to being laughed at. He opened the portfolio, revealing a neatly typed contract and a bank statement he'd had his assistant print. "The debt that's threatening to close this shop, your mother's medical treatments. I'll cover all of it. In exchange, you pretend to be my fiancé for 6 months. Lena's smile vanished, replaced by a cool, piercing stare. She pushed the portfolio back across the counter with the tip of her finger. "So, you want to rent my future to fix yours? My coffee shop might be struggling, Mr. Vance," she said, her eyes flicking down to the name on the contract, "but my dignity isn't for sale." Her flat-out refusal caught him off guard. No one said no to him. It was an unwritten rule of his universe. "Every woman has a price," he retorted, a cold, foolish mistake the instant the words left his lips. "And every arrogant man thinks he can afford it," she shot back, crossing her arms. "Get out." He was losing. Desperate, knowing what was at stake, Julian switched tactics. He let the corporate armor fall away, just for a second, allowing a flicker of his real desperation to show. "Please," he said, and the word felt foreign on his tongue, "I need help. My family... It's complicated." Lena studied him for a long, silent moment. She saw past the expensive suit and the arrogant posture. She saw the hint of panic in his eyes, the look of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. "All right," she said finally, to his utter shock. "I'll do it, but on my terms." Julian felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "Anything. Whatever they are." "Rule number 1, she began, holding up a finger. "No lies between us. We lie to the world, not to each other. We are business partners in this farce, and partners need to be honest with one another." "Agreed," he said quickly. "Rule number 2, you treat me with respect. I'm your partner, not your property. You don't get to order me around or look down on me because I make coffee for a living." "Of course." "And rule number 3, she smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "One Saturday a month, you work here, behind this counter. It's time you learned a little something about real life." Julian stared at her, dumbfounded. Work as a barista? It was the most absurd thing he had ever heard. He, Julian Vance, whose time was billed in 4-figure increments, was being asked to froth milk and take orders. But looking at the defiant, unbreakable woman in front of him, he knew he had no choice. He was cornered, and she knew it. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. She shook it. Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. "Welcome to the strangest engagement in history, Mr. Vance. Try not to burn the milk." Julian's first Saturday at Lena's corner was an unmitigated disaster. Clad in an apron that seemed comically small over his designer shirt, he managed to burn 3 pitchers of milk, mistake a cappuccino for a macchiato, and receive a 5-minute lecture from a teenager on why his latte art looked like a sad cloud. Lena watched the whole spectacle from a corner, arms crossed, trying to suppress her laughter and failing miserably. "Remember, Vance," she'd tease, "the customer is always right, even when they ask for a decaf oat milk latte with a shot of regret." "This isn't funny," he grumbled, wiping up spilled milk for the third time. "It's absolutely hilarious," she corrected. "I haven't had this much fun since my blender exploded last year." But amidst the chaos, something began to shift within him. Julian watched Lena work, a whirlwind of efficiency and grace. He saw her greet regulars by name, asking about their kids, their jobs, remembering their favorite orders. He saw the passion she had for every bean she ground, for every pastry she arranged. This wasn't just a shop, it was a community, and she was its beating heart. He was used to managing people, but Lena didn't manage, she connected. "Why do you do this?" he asked at the end of the long day, as they were cleaning the shop together, the scent of coffee and sugar hanging in the air. "With this much drive, you could be managing one of my corporate teams." Her movements stilled for a moment. "Because this was my father's dream," she said softly, her gaze becoming distant. "He always wanted to own a small place where people could just stop, breathe, and have a quiet moment of peace. He never got the chance to do it. I'm doing it for him." The sincerity in her voice struck him. He had never thought of his own work as fulfilling a dream, only as continuing a duty. His entire life had been a series of expectations he was meant to meet, a legacy he was meant to uphold. The concept of doing something purely out of love and remembrance was foreign to him. On Monday morning, a state-of-the-art coffee grinder arrived at the shop. There was no card, but Lena knew. She picked up her phone. "I said no gifts, Vance," she said, foregoing a greeting. "It's not a gift," he replied from his sterile office on the Surserwooth floor of the Vance Global Tower. "It's an investment in our business partnership. A superior grinder leads to a superior coffee, which leads to happier customers, which in turn makes our fake engagement more believable. It's pure logic." Lena smiled to herself on the other end of the line. "Your logic is terrible, Vance. But the coffee is going to be amazing, isn't it?" She paused. "Yeah," she admitted, "it's going to be amazing." As their fake engagement, Julian found that the moments he looked forward to most weren't his board meetings or high-stakes deals. They were the late-night phone calls with Lena, where they would debrief on their relationship for the benefit of anyone who might be listening in, but would inevitably end up arguing about the merits of a new hazelnut syrup or the dreams she had for the future. He was discovering the woman behind the barista, intelligent, stubborn, fiercely loyal, and with a sharp sense of humor that could cut through his corporate armor with a single sentence. He was falling for her, and it was the most illogical, terrifying, and exhilarating thing that had ever happened to him. The first real test came in the form of a formal charity gala. "It's unavoidable," Julian had explained over the phone. "My mother is one of the chairs. She'll expect to see my blushing fiancé. We have to go." Lena had groaned. "Gala? Julian, my wardrobe consists of jeans, t-shirts, and an apron. The fanciest thing I own is a pair of boots that doesn't have a hole in the sole." "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it," he'd said. "Rule number 2, Vance, no dressing me up like your personal doll." "It's not about dressing you up. It's about giving you the right armor for the battlefield," he'd countered. "Trust me." To her own surprise, she did. A long, elegant box arrived at her apartment the next day. Inside was a simple midnight blue gown. It wasn't flashy or covered in sequins. It was understated, classic, and incredibly beautiful. There was also a small, handwritten note. "So they see the woman, not the dress. J." When he picked her up that night, he was speechless for a solid 10 seconds. She looked radiant. The dress fit her perfectly, and she'd styled her hair in a simple but elegant updo. For the first time, he saw her not as the sassy barista or his fake fiancée, but simply as a stunning woman. You look, he started, but couldn't find the right word. Don't say it, she warned, a playful smile on her face. Rule number 2. He smiled back. Rule number 2 is officially suspended for the evening. The gala was exactly as suffocating as Lena had imagined. A sea of forced smiles, air kisses, and conversations that were all about status and networking. As soon as they walked in, they were descended upon by Julian's mother, with Isabella Sterling in tow, looking like a predatory flamingo in a bright pink dress. "Julian, darling," Eleanor purred, ignoring Lena completely at first. And Lena, "What a simple dress." "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," Lena replied sweetly. "I believe in letting one's personality be the main accessory." Isabella laughed, a sound like tiny, sharp icicles. "How quaint, Julian. I was just telling my father that the final merger papers are ready to be signed. Once this little distraction of yours is over, we can proceed." "Isabella, Lena is not a distraction," Julian said, his voice firm as he instinctively put a hand on the small of Lena's back. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by either woman. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in passive aggression. People would talk to Julian while angling their bodies away from Lena. Women would give her condescending smiles and ask what she did, their tone implying the answer couldn't possibly be interesting. Through it all, Lena was magnificent. She handled every snide remark with a witty comeback. She discussed the economics of small business with a venture capitalist who had tried to corner her, leaving him impressed. She charmed an elderly board member by talking about his prize-winning roses. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving on her own terms. Julian found himself watching her, completely mesmerized. He had brought her here as a shield, a pawn in his game against his father. But she was no one's pawn. She was a queen in her own right, holding court in a world that was designed to exclude her. The turning point came late in the evening. They were standing near the terrace when Robert Vance approached them, his face a thundercloud. "Julian, a word," he commanded. He led his son a few feet away, but his voice was low and menacing enough for Lena to overhear. "This charade ends now. I've had my people look into your little barista. A mountain of debt, a sick mother, a dead father who, I might add, used to be one of our factory foremen before we had to size." Every word was a calculated. "She is nothing, Julian. A nobody you picked up off the street to defy me. You will end this tonight, or I will. I will personally see to it that her little shop is buried under so much regulatory red tape that she won't be able to sell a cup of coffee for the next decade. Do you understand me?" Julian stood frozen, the threat hanging heavy in the air. He looked at his father, then back at Lena, who had heard everything. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a fire he had never seen before. He saw the flicker of pain, the hurt, but underneath it there was no fear. There was only steel. He knew in that moment that this had stopped being about a merger. It had stopped being about defiance. It was about the woman standing 10 feet away, who had more integrity in her little finger than his entire family had in their vast empire. He had to make a choice, and for the first time in his life, the choice felt terrifyingly, beautifully his own. The car ride back from the gala was a tomb of silence. The vibrant city lights streaked past the windows, but inside the Bentley, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Julian gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He could feel Lena's presence beside him, a mixture of coiled tension and quiet dignity. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating quiet. But what could he say? "Was sorry. My father threatened to destroy your life to secure a business deal?" Gladys, it sounded pathetic even in his own head. When they pulled up to her modest apartment building, he turned off the engine and finally faced her. "Lena, don't," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting him off before he could even start. She didn't look angry, she didn't look scared, she looked weary, like a soldier after a long battle. "I knew what I was getting into, Julian. A world of powerful people who see others as pawns. I just didn't expect the king to declare checkmate so soon. He won't get away with it, Julian said, his voice low and intense. I won't let him. She finally turned to look at him, her brown eyes searching his. And what are you going to do? Fight your own father? Risk your entire empire for a coffee shop and a fake fiancé? It stopped being fake for me a while ago, he admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. Lena's expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of vulnerability that she quickly extinguished. Don't make promises you can't keep, Julian. It's the one thing I can't afford. She opened the car door. I need to think. Before he could say another word, she was gone, disappearing into the building and leaving him alone in the silence of his luxury car, which had never felt more like a cage. Julian didn't go back to his sterile mansion. He drove aimlessly through the city, his father's words echoing in his mind. Rijai will personally see to it that her little shop is buried. Gradient, it was a threat, but it was also a test. His father was forcing his hand, expecting him to fold, to choose the empire over the girl, as he always had, as Vance was expected. But when he thought of Lena, of her sarcastic laugh, of her fierce independence, of the way she talked about her father's dream with such reverence, he felt a protective instinct so fierce it shocked him. This wasn't about a merger anymore. This was about right and wrong. The next morning, Lena walked into her coffee shop with a heavy heart. She expected to spend the day worrying, making contingency plans, feeling the familiar dread of impending disaster. But what she found was Julian. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in jeans and a simple gray Henley, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was behind the counter, an apron tied around his waist, already grinding coffee beans. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and suspicion. "You said I had to work one Saturday a month," he said without looking up from the grinder. "I figured I'd start my shift early. We've got a business to protect." She stared at him, speechless. He wasn't in his tower strategizing with lawyers. He was here, in her shop, ready to work. It was the most unexpected, most powerful statement he could have made. "You're an idiot, Vance," she said, a small, watery smile finally breaking through her resolve. "I've been told," he replied, finally looking at her. His eyes were tired, but they held a new kind of determination. "Now, are you going to stand there all day, or are you going to teach me how to make that latte art that doesn't look like a Rorschach test?" That day something shifted. They didn't talk about Robert Vance, they didn't talk about the threat. They worked. They served coffee, they chatted with customers, they cleaned the machines side by side. It was a silent act of solidarity, a declaration of a shared front. Julian, for the first time, wasn't a CEO playing a part. He was just a man trying to help the woman he was falling for save her dream. But what Lena did next was what truly shocked him. That evening, after they had closed the shop, she sat him down at one of the small tables, a laptop open between them. "I was up all night," she said, her voice all business. "I'm not going to be a damsel in distress, Julian. I'm your partner in this, remember? And partners solve problems." She turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was a detailed business proposal. "What is this?" he asked. "It's called Lena's Corner, the franchise model. I've mapped out a plan for expansion, small-scale, community-focused coffee shops leveraging the brand story of you local quality. I've identified 3 potential locations in underserved neighborhoods. I've projected the costs, the potential revenue, everything. Your father wants to bury one shop? Fine, let's give him a dozen to worry about." Julian stared at the screen, then back at her. He was floored. He had expected tears, fear, maybe even for her to ask for a payout to disappear. He had never, in a million years, expected a meticulously researched, brilliantly conceived business plan. She wasn't just defending, she was counterattacking. He was at a loss for words. "This is brilliant, Lena." "I know," she said with a confident smirk. "I just needed the right motivation. And for the record, your father is a terrible motivator, but an excellent catalyst." He started laughing, a deep, genuine laugh of pure admiration. But the capital, even for a small expansion, we'd need significant investment. And with my father actively working against us, that's where you come in, she said, her expression turning serious. You know the investors. You know the game. I have the vision, the product, and the work ethic. You have the access. We do this together. As real partners. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since he first started his own company, pure, unadulterated excitement. She wasn't just his fake fiancée. She was his equal. All right, partner, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Let's go to war. The following weeks were a blur of intense activity. Julian used his network, calling in old favors and reaching out to a select group of investors he knew valued innovation over old-school politics. He framed the expansion of Lena's Corner not as a passion project, but as a disruptive new force in the coffee market, a scalable, community-centric model that was the antithesis of the soulless corporate chains. Lena, meanwhile, was in her element. She refined her business plan, developed training protocols for future employees, and perfected new recipes. Julian watched, fascinated, as the simple barista transformed into a sharp, insightful entrepreneur. Their late-night calls were no longer about their fake relationship, but about real business. They argued over marketing strategies and debated the pros and cons of different real estate locations. They were building something real together, and in the process, the lines between their business partnership and their personal feelings blurred until they were indistinguishable. One night, they were working late in Lena's small apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets and coffee samples. Julian looked up from a financial projection and saw her chewing on the end of her pen, a deep frown of concentration on her face. You know, he said softly, you're the most formidable person I've ever met. She looked up, surprised. More formidable than your father? My father uses power. You, he said, gesturing to the plans scattered around them, you build your power from scratch, with nothing but coffee beans and sheer force of will. It's much more impressive. A blush crept up her neck. Don't get all soft on me, Vance. We have work to do. But her smile gave her away. They secured their first round of funding from a younger, more progressive venture capital firm that loved the idea of backing a David against Goliath like Robert Vance. With the capital in place, they signed the leases for 2 new locations. Their victory felt imminent. But Robert Vance was not a man who took defeat lightly. He had one more card to play, a secret he had kept buried for years, and he was about to use it to destroy not just their business, but the very foundation of what they were building. The bomb landed in the form of a manila envelope, delivered by courier to Julian's office. There was no note. Inside was a single yellow document, a decade-old employee termination file from Vance Global. The employee's name was Eduardo. Julian's blood ran cold as he read. The file detailed the necessary downsizing his father had mentioned. But attached to it was another confidential memo he had never seen before. It was an internal investigation report. Eduardo Silva hadn't just been laid off. He had been a whistleblower. He had discovered that the construction division, managed at the time by a close associate of Robert's, was using subpar materials on a major public housing project. He had reported it internally, and a week later, his position was eliminated. The world seemed to spin. Lena's father. He wasn't just a casualty of corporate restructuring. He had been punished for his integrity, and the man who signed off on it all was his own father. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Robert. Some foundations are too rotten to build on. It's time to come home, son. Alas. Julian stared at the file, then at his phone. This wasn't just a business problem anymore. This was a moral abyss. He had brought Lena into his world, promising to protect her, only to discover that the monster she had been fighting her whole life had his family's name. How could he ever look her in the eye again? How could their partnership, their feelings, their entire relationship survive a truth this devastating? Julian felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The polished chrome and glass of his office, usually a symbol of his power and control, suddenly felt like the cold, hard bars of a prison. He read the memo again, and then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into a less damning configuration. They didn't. Whistleblower, subpar materials, position eliminated lies. It wasn't just corporate jargon, it was the story of a good man being crushed by a system designed to protect its own. A system his father had built. He thought of Lena, of the quiet dignity with which she spoke of her father's dream. He thought of her trying to honor his memory by building something pure and honest with her own two hands. And all along, the very foundation of his own family's wealth was built on the rubble of hers. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like poison. His first instinct was to hide it, to bury the file, pretend he never saw it, and continue fighting his father on the battlefield of business. But he knew he couldn't. Not with Lena. Their entire fragile partnership was built on a new, unspoken rule: no more lies. Hiding this would be the ultimate betrayal. A lie of omission so profound it would invalidate everything they had built. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her name. What would he even say? Straight by the way, that coffee shop you built in your father's memory? He was a hero that my family destroyed to save a few bucks. Breda, he felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. He was his father's son, cut from the same corrupt cloth. He didn't call, he couldn't. Instead, he drove. He didn't go to Lena's corner or her apartment. He went to the one place that felt appropriately desolate, the abandoned site of the old Vance Global factory on the industrial outskirts of the city. This was where Eduardo Silva had worked. This was where the decision had been made. He stood there for hours, the crumbling brick edifice a monument to his family's sins, until the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the cracked pavement. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about beating his father or expanding a coffee empire. It was about seeking a forgiveness he was sure he didn't deserve. Lena knew something was wrong. Julian had been silent all day. No calls, no texts, no witty emails about the latest crisis in the coffee bean supply chain. By evening, a knot of anxiety had tightened in her stomach. She told herself it was just business, that he was probably wrapped up in some corporate drama. But a deeper, more primal instinct told her this silence was different. She was closing up the shop when his car pulled up. He got out, and the man walking toward her was not the confident CEO or the charming, clumsy barista in training. He looked broken. His shoulders were slumped. His usual sharp suit was rumpled, and his eyes held a depth of pain that made her own heart ache in response. "Julian, what is it? What's happened?" she asked, her voice laced with concern as she unlocked the door to let him in. He didn't speak. He just walked past her into the darkened shop and handed her the manila envelope. "You need to see this," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She sat down at one of the small tables, the familiar comfort of her shop suddenly feeling alien. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and pulled out the old termination file. She saw her father's name, his employee number, and then she saw the memo. She read it slowly, her world tilting on its axis. The words blurred, the story they told so monstrous, so deeply personal, that she couldn't breathe. The whispers of her childhood, her father's sudden unemployment, the crushing depression that followed, the shame he carried until his final day, it all snapped into focus. It wasn't just bad luck, it wasn't a necessary downsizing, it was a punishment. He had been silenced. She looked up at Julian, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a dawning, terrible understanding. "Your father," she... "Yes," he said, his voice raw. "He knew he did this." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Lena felt a storm of emotions warring inside her, grief for her father, a white-hot rage at Robert Vance, and a deep, aching sorrow for the man standing before her. She could see the guilt tearing him apart. He was waiting for her to scream, to accuse him, to throw him out, and tell him she never wanted to see him again. It was what he deserved. It was what he expected. But as she looked at him, she didn't just see the son of the man who had ruined her family. She saw the man who had learned to make lattes, who had defended her at a gala, who had looked at her with an admiration that made her feel seen for the first time in years. She saw the man who was just as much a victim of Robert Vance's manipulations as she was. "This wasn't your fault, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He looked at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "How can you say that? My name is on the building. My life was funded by this. I am a part of it." "You didn't know," she insisted. "Did you?" "No," he admitted. "But that doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," she said, standing up and walking over to him. She stood before him, so close she could see the torment in his blue eyes. "Your father did this. Not you. He used you. He used me. He used his power to hurt people. Are you going to let him win? Are you going to let his past define our future?" "What future, Lena?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How can there be a future for us after this? Every time you look at me, you'll see him. You'll see what my family did to yours." "No," she said, and she reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple, profound gesture of comfort. "When I look at you, I see the man who stood in this shop and told me he wanted to go to war for me. I see the man who believed in my dream. I see the man I'm falling in love with." Julian stared at her, overwhelmed. He had come here expecting condemnation, and instead, she was offering him grace. He had expected to be pushed away, and she was pulling him closer. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Then be the man who does," she replied. "Don't let your father's legacy be your own. Build a new one, right here, with me." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair. He held on to her like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. For the first time in his life, Julian Vance wasn't in control. He was completely, utterly vulnerable. And in Lena's arms, it felt less like falling and more like finally being found. The next morning, a different kind of war council convened in the back room of Lena's corner. It wasn't about franchise models or marketing plans. It was about justice. "We can't sue," Julian explained, pacing the small room. "The statute of limitations has long passed, and my father has the best lawyers in the country. They'll bury us in legal motions before we ever see the inside of a courtroom." "So we just let him get away with it?" Lena asked, her arms crossed, the fire back in her eyes. "No," Julian said, a new, cold determination settling over him. "We don't play his game, we change the board." For the next 2 days, they worked. Julian used his knowledge of the corporate world, and Lena used her innate understanding of people and narratives. They weren't trying to win a legal battle, they were preparing to win the court of public opinion. Julian reached out to a handful of journalists he knew. The real kind, the ones who cared about truth more than access. He didn't give them the whole story, just a single verifiable tip: look into the old Northwood public housing project. The one Vance Global built a decade ago. There are rumors about structural issues, about materials. Simultaneously, Lena began a quiet, grassroots campaign. She created an anonymous online forum for former Vance Global employees from that era. She posted a simple message: "Did you work on the Northwood project? Did you see something that didn't feel right? You're not alone." At first there was silence, then one person responded, then another. Stories began to trickle in, tales of being pressured to cut corners, of falsified safety reports, of colleagues who had spoken up and were mysteriously let go. A pattern emerged, a tapestry of corruption woven by his father's greed. The final piece of their plan was the riskiest. Julian knew his father kept meticulous private records, a shadow ledger of every deal, every favor, every skeleton in the Vance Global closet. It was his ultimate insurance. Julian knew it was hidden in a safe behind a painting in his father's home office, an office he hadn't been welcome in for years. "It's too dangerous," Lena said when he told her the plan. "He'll have security, alarms." "I know the codes," Julian said simply. "He taught them to me when I was a boy, when he still thought I would be just like him." The night of the planned infiltration was tense. Lena waited at the coffee shop, her phone clutched in her hand, her stomach in knots. Julian, dressed in black, slipped into his childhood home like a ghost. He moved through the silent, cavernous rooms, each one a memory of a cold and lonely upbringing. He reached the office. As he had predicted, the alarm codes were the same. He swung the heavy oil painting aside, revealing the cold steel of the safe. He entered the combination, his own birthday, a touch of paternal irony that now felt sick. The safe clicked open. Inside, among folders of financial documents, was the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book. He opened it, his hands shaking slightly. It was all there, page after page of illicit deals, political payoffs, and at the very end, a detailed entry about the Northwood project. It named the manager who had been the fall guy, and detailed the severance package given to him in exchange for his silence. And it mentioned the elimination of the Foreman Silva problem. He took out his phone and began photographing every single page. Just as he was snapping the last picture, he heard a sound from the hallway. Footsteps. His heart leaped into his throat. He quickly closed the ledger, put it back, and shut the safe, spinning the dial. He swung the painting back into place just as the office door opened. It was Robert Vance. He stood in the doorway, a glass of brandy in one hand, his eyes cold and assessing. He looked at Julian, then at the painting, then back at his son. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "Looking for something, Julian?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I always knew you had a little larceny in you. It's about time." Julian's blood ran cold. For a split second, every ounce of his corporate training, every instinct for negotiation and damage control, screamed at him to lie, to deflect, to create a plausible story. But as he looked at his father, standing there with that smug, proprietary smile, something inside him snapped. The part of him that had always craved his father's approval, that had bent and twisted itself to fit the mold of a Vance, finally broke. He was done playing game. "I found it," Julian said, his voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "The ledger. The proof of what you did to Eduardo Silva and to countless others." Robert's smile didn't falter. He took a slow sip of his brandy, the picture of unnerving calm. "Proof? Julian, that book is my private property. Illegally obtained evidence isn't admissible in court. Even if you walked out of here with it, which you won't, it would be useless. It's my word against yours. And who do you think the world will believe? The titan who built this city, or the disgruntled son having a temper tantrum over a coffee shop girl?" "You're right," Julian agreed, a move that momentarily threw his father off balance. "It's not for a court of law. It's for a different kind of jury." Before Robert could react, Julian turned and bolted. He ran through the marble halls of the mansion, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing like gunshots in the oppressive silence. He heard his father shout his name, a command laced with fury, but he didn't stop. He burst out the front door, vaulted over a manicured hedge, and disappeared into the darkness of the street, the digital copies of his father's sins burning a hole in his phone's memory. He drove straight to Lena's corner, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found her pacing the floor, her face pale with worry. "Did you get it?" she asked, rushing to him the moment he walked in. "I got it," he said, breathing heavily. "He saw me. He knows." "What do we do now?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Now," Julian said, a grim determination setting in, "we light the fuse." The next hours were a carefully orchestrated whirlwind. Julian and Lena didn't sleep. Fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose, they executed the final phase of their plan. Julian sent the encrypted photos of the ledger to the investigative journalist he had contacted, along with an anonymous tip connecting the dots between Eduardo Silva's termination and the shady materials used in the Northwood project. Lena, meanwhile, took the stories that had been shared on the anonymous forum and began weaving them into a single, powerful narrative. She stripped them of names and identifying details but kept the raw, emotional truth. She wrote about the foreman who was forced to sign off on unsafe materials, the young inspector who was threatened into silence, the families who lived in the crumbling housing project, unaware of the danger above their heads. She wasn't a journalist, but she was a storyteller, and she knew how to speak to the heart. She sent the completed narrative to a popular local blogger known for his advocacy for social justice, someone who had a loyal following and a reputation for being unafraid of powerful figures. They had planted the seeds. Now, all they could do was wait for them to grow. The first story broke at dawn. The Chicago Chronicle, the city's most respected newspaper, ran a front-page exposé. Vance Global's crumbling legacy, whistleblowers silencing linked to unsafe public housing. The article was a bombshell, meticulously researched and backed by Julian's leaked documents. It didn't just accuse, it proved. By Joe AM, the local news channels had picked up the story. By noon, it was national news. The social justice blog published Lena's narrative, and it went viral. The anonymous stories of the workers gave a human face to the corporate malfeasance. VanceGate started trending on social media. At Vance Global headquarters, it was chaos. The stock was in freefall. The phones were ringing off the hook with calls from panicked investors and angry city officials demanding an immediate structural review of the Northwood project. In the midst of the storm, Robert Vance was a study in controlled fury. He was in the boardroom with his crisis management team, barking orders, threatening lawsuits, and trying to spin the narrative. He painted Julian as a volatile, lovesick fool being manipulated by a gold-digging opportunist. He called the allegations baseless, the documents forgeries. But the damage was done. The story was too compelling, the evidence too clear. That afternoon, Julian and Lena were at the coffee shop, watching the news unfold on a small TV propped on the counter. The place was packed with regulars who had come to offer their support, their presence a quiet shield against the storm raging outside. "He's going to come after you," Lena said, her voice low. "He's not going to take this lying down." "I know," Julian replied, his gaze fixed on the screen where his father's face was plastered next to the headline. "But he's not fighting me anymore. He's fighting the truth, and that's a battle he can't win." Just then, the bell above the door chimed, and Isabella Sterling walked in. She was dressed impeccably as always, but her usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of bewildered shock. She walked straight to their table. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "All of it?" Julian just nodded. She sank into a nearby chair, shaking her head. "My father's pulling out of the merger. He said he won't be associated with this kind of scandal. Our family's, the deal is dead." She looked at Julian, her eyes filled with a strange mix of anger and something that looked like reluctant respect. "You actually did it. You blew it all up." "I didn't blow it up, Isabella," Julian said calmly. "I just exposed the cracks that were already there." "For her?" she asked, gesturing toward Lena. "For my own conscience," he corrected. "And yes, for her." Isabella was silent for a long moment. Then she stood up. "Well," she said, a hint of her old arrogance returning, "I suppose I should thank you. You saved me from marrying into a family with even more skeletons in its closet than my own." She turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Lena let out a long breath. "Well, I guess you're officially single." Julian laughed, the sound tinged with relief. "I guess I am." He reached across the table and took her hand. "So, what does my completely not fake fiancé think we should do now?" "Now," Lena said, her eyes sparkling, "we make more coffee. The whole city is watching us. We'd better give them a good show." The show, however, was far from over. That evening, as they were preparing to close, a black town car pulled up outside the shop. The door opened and Robert Vance got out. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like an old, tired man. He walked into the shop, his eyes scanning the simple, homey space before landing on Julian and Lena, who stood united behind the counter. "You've made quite a mess, Julian," Robert said, his voice heavy. "I just cleaned up the one you made, Father," Julian replied, his tone even. Robert ignored him and turned his full attention to Lena. "You," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You must be very proud of yourself. You've managed to do what no business rival, no market crash, no recession has ever done. You've brought this family to its knees." Lena didn't flinch. She wiped down the counter with a cloth, her movements calm and deliberate. "Your family was already on its knees, Mr. Vance. You just built a palace on top of it so no one would notice." The old man's face flushed with anger. "You have no idea what it takes to build an empire. The sacrifices, the My father made a hard decision," Lena shot back, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "He chose to be honest, and you sacrificed him for it. Don't you dare talk to me about sacrifice." The force of her words seemed to physically push Robert back a step. He stared at her, for the first time, not as a coffee shop girl or a nuisance, but as an adversary he had fatally underestimated. "It's over," Julian said, stepping forward to stand beside Lena, a solid, unshakable presence. "The city has launched a full investigation into the Northwood project. The former employees are talking to reporters. The ledger is with the district attorney. It's over." Robert looked from his son to Lena, and something in his ironclad demeanor finally seemed to crumble. It wasn't defeat, it was a deeper, more profound sense of loss. He had lost his company's reputation, he had lost the merger, but in that moment, standing in a small coffee shop that smelled of cinnamon, he seemed to realize he had lost his son, too. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him, a final, quiet note marking the end of an era. Julian and Lena stood in the silence, the weight of the day finally settling on them. He wrapped his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Is it really over?" she whispered. "The fight with him is," Julian said, "but for us, I think it's just beginning." He looked around the small shop, at the worn tables and mismatched chairs, at the place where he had learned what it meant to work, to care, to fight for something real. This was his new empire. It wasn't built on steel and glass, but on coffee beans and courage. And it was the only one he ever wanted. The aftermath of a storm is a strange and silent thing. For days, the business world had been rocked by the Vance Gate scandal. But after Robert Vance's quiet retreat from the coffee shop, an eerie calm settled over them. The battle was won, but the rebuilding had just begun. Lena's corner, once a quiet neighborhood haven, became the unofficial headquarters for the new Vance Global, or whatever it was going to become. The first few days were a blur. Julian, with Lena constantly by his side, worked tirelessly. He wasn't just a CEO anymore, he was a leader trying to hold a fractured company together. He spent hours on the phone with investors, not with his old arrogance, but with a new, startling humility. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He laid out the truth, admitted the company's past failings, and presented his vision for a future built on transparency and ethics. Investors, both others, intrigued by this new, honest version of Julian Vance, decided to stay and see what would happen. Lena, in turn, became the heart of the operation. She organized meetings, she made sure everyone was fed from the shop's kitchen, and most importantly, she listened. She talked to the employees, from the coders on the center floor to the maintenance crew in the basement, gathering their ideas, their fears, and their hopes. She was the bridge between Julian's world of strategy and, the real world of the people who made the company run. "You know," Julian said one night, as they were the last two left in the shop, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scattered papers, "I've had dozens of high-paid consultants in my life. None of them have given me better advice than you." "That's because my advice is simple," she said, stacking a pile of napkins. "Treat people like they matter." "A revolutionary concept in the corporate world," he said, with a wry smile. "Maybe it shouldn't be," she replied, her gaze meeting his. Their biggest test came a week later. The board had called an emergency meeting. They demanded Julian address the media, to control the narrative. The old Julian would have issued a cold, sterile press release. But this was the new Julian. He agreed to a live press conference. Lena helped him prepare, not by writing a script, but by asking him one question over and over: "What is the truth you want to tell?" Lustered. When he stepped up to the podium, the room was a blinding flash of cameras. He didn't look at a teleprompter. He looked directly into the cameras, as if speaking to each person individually. "Good morning," he began. "For the past week, my company, Vance Global, has been at the center of a storm. And I am not here today to make excuses. I'm here to take responsibility. The reports you've read are true. A decade ago, a good man named Eduardo Silva was wronged by this company. His integrity was punished, and his life was irrevocably altered. There is no excuse for that. It was a failure of leadership and a failure of morality." He paused, the room hanging on his every word. "I cannot change the past, but I can, and I will, change the future of this company. Vance Global will no longer be a place where profit is valued above people. We are launching a full independent audit of all past projects. We will establish the Silva Foundation to support families and individuals impacted by corporate negligence. And we will be restructuring our entire leadership to ensure that accountability and ethics are at the core of everything we do." A reporter shouted from the back, "Mr. Vance, your father has been a giant in this industry. Are you saying he was wrong?" Julian looked straight ahead, his expression unwavering. "I'm saying that a legacy is not just what you build, it's what you stand for. And I am choosing to stand for something different." Then he did something no one expected, "But the real credit for this change doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people who never lost their integrity. People like Eduardo Silva, and people like Lena," he said, and though she wasn't in the room, everyone knew who he meant. "She reminded me that a business, a life, a future is worthless if it's not built on a foundation of truth. Thank you." He walked away from the podium, leaving a stunned and silent press corps behind him. He hadn't just given a statement, he had delivered a manifesto. That evening, Lena was at her mother's apartment, helping her sort through old photos. Her mother, Carmen, had been following the news with a mixture of pride and trepidation. "He's a good boy, that Julian," Carmen said, holding up a faded picture of a young Lena with a missing front tooth. "Under all that money, I think he has a good heart." "He's trying, Mom," Lena said. "He's really trying." "And you, Echmija de Latist, are you happy?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. I think I am," Lena admitted. "It's scary. His world is so different. But when I'm with him, it doesn't feel different. It just feels... Rive." There was a knock on the door. Lena opened it to find Julian standing there, looking nervous and holding a bouquet of daisies, the kind that grew wild in the park near her old apartment. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "Julian," Lena said, surprised. "Come in." He stepped into the small, cozy living room, looking even more out of place than he had in the coffee shop. Carmen stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone polite but guarded. "Please call me Julian," he said, handing the flowers to Lena before turning to her mother. "Mrs. Gonzalez, I came here because there was something I needed to do. I needed to apologize to you in person for what my family did to yours, for the pain it caused your husband and you. There are no words to fix it, but I needed you to hear from me that I am deeply, truly sorry." Carmen studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seeing more than he was comfortable with. She saw the sincerity, the guilt, the hope. Finally, she nodded slowly. "My Eduardo was a proud man," she said, her voice thick with memory. "He would have appreciated you saying that. Thank you, Julian." She then looked from Julian to her daughter, seeing the unspoken connection between them. "Now," she said, her tone shifting to one of a mischievous matchmaker, "I'm going to go make some tea. You two talk." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving them alone. "You didn't have to do that," Lena said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "It was about respect." He looked around the small apartment, at the worn but loved furniture, the pictures on the wall. "This is a home, Lena. My mansion is just a house. You've taught me the difference." "A home is just people you love," she said. "I know," he said, his gaze intense. "That's why I'm here." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. They were standing in the middle of her mother's living room. The smell of brewing tea in the air, a world away from the boardrooms and galas that had defined his life. "Lena," he began, his voice a little unsteady, "when I first met you, I thought you were a problem to be managed, a complication in a business deal. Then I thought you were a fascinating puzzle to be solved. But I was wrong. You were never any of those things. You were a mirror." "A mirror?" "You showed me who I really was. A man hiding behind his father's name, afraid to make his own choices. And you showed me who I could be. Someone who stands for something. Someone who fights for what's right. Someone who loves." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I've messed this up from the start. I lied to you. I used you. I doubted you. But through all of it, you've shown me nothing but grace and strength. You are the strongest, most incredible woman I have ever known. And the idea of living my life without you is no longer just a bad business proposition, unthinkable." He let go of one of her hands and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, velvet box. It wasn't the kind from a famous jewelry store on Fifth Avenue. It was older, a little worn at the edges. "Julian," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. He knelt down on one knee, right there on the slightly faded rug of her mother's living room. "This was my mother's," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a single sapphire, not a diamond. "She was a kind woman, a lot like you. She believed in love, not arrangements. My father put this ring away after she passed, said it was too sentimental. I think she would have wanted you to have it." He looked up at her, his blue eyes pleading, vulnerable, and full of a love so profound it stole her breath. "Lena Silva," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm not asking you to be my fake fiancé. I'm not offering a contract. I'm offering my whole heart, my whole life, everything that I am and everything I hope to become. Will you do me the honor of building a new legacy with me? Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop. The only sound was the soft whistle of the tea kettle from the kitchen. Lena looked down at the man kneeling before her, the man who had turned his entire world upside down, the man who had learned to be a hero, her hero. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Julian, 1,000 times yes." Julian slid the sapphire ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood up, his face etched with a relief so profound it looked as though he had been holding his breath for his entire life. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, not with the desperate impulsiveness of their first kiss in his mansion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness that spoke of promises made and a future claimed. From the kitchen doorway, Carmen Gonzalez watched, a tear rolling down her own cheek and a wide smile on her face. She held 2 cups of tea, forgotten in her hands. She had always prayed her daughter would find a man who saw her worth. She just never imagined he'd show up in a $5,000 suit and have to be taught how to make coffee. The wedding was nothing like what the Chicago society pages would have expected from a Vance. There was no cathedral, no 1,000-person guest list, no string quartet playing Vivaldi. Instead, 3 months later, on a perfect autumn afternoon, they were married in the newly expanded and renovated backyard of Lena's Corner. The coffee shop itself had become their testament. With Julian's business acumen and Lena's vision, Lena's Corner was no longer just a shop, it was a brand. The 2 new locations they had planned were thriving, each one managed by people from the neighborhood, creating jobs and become. Julian had stepped down as CEO of Vance Global, taking a less public role as a board member and focusing his energy on the Silva Foundation and his partnership with Lena. The company, under new leadership handpicked by Julian, was slowly but surely rebuilding its reputation on a new foundation of ethics and transparency. Their wedding reflected this new life. The guests were a vibrant mix of their 2 worlds. Lena's family and friends from her neighborhood mingled with a small, carefully selected group of Julian's true allies, the colleagues who had stood by him, the few investors who had believed in his vision. There were no Sterlings, and Robert Vance had declined his invitation, a silent, final admission of his defeat. Lena walked down an aisle of scattered autumn leaves, on the arm of her proud mother. She wore a simple, cream-colored lace dress that she had bought at a small local boutique. She looked radiant, happy, and completely at peace. Julian waited for her under an archway, built from reclaimed wood, from the old factory where her father had once worked, a detail he had arranged as a surprise. As he watched her approach, he felt a sense of rightness so complete it was overwhelming. This was real. This was home. They wrote their own vows. Julian, a man who once communicated through contracts and memos, spoke from the heart. "Lena," he began, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hands, "you walked into my life when it was all black and white, a world of profit margins and strategic alliances. You painted it in color. You taught me that strength isn't about control, it's about courage. That value isn't on a balance sheet, it's in the connections we make. I used to think I had everything, but I was empty. With you, even if I had nothing, I would be whole. I love you, and I promise to spend the rest of my life earning the incredible gift of your love." Lena smiled through her tears when it was her turn. "Julian," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you came into my life like a storm, a man in a fancy suit with an impossible proposition. I thought you were my biggest problem, but you turned out to be my greatest adventure. You saw past the apron and the coffee stains and saw me. You taught me that it's okay to let someone in, that it's okay to be taken care of. You showed me that even the most guarded hearts can learn to love. I promise to always challenge you, to always make you laugh, and to always be your partner, in business and in life. I love you." When they were pronounced husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in cheers. Julian pulled Lena into a kiss that was a celebration of everything they had overcome and everything that lay ahead. The reception was a joyous, relaxed affair. Instead of a catered 5-course meal, a local food truck served tacos. Instead of champagne, guests drank craft beer and Lena's signature lattes. The music was a mix of old soul and Latin rhythms, and the dance floor was never empty. Julian watched as his mother-in-law, Carmen, taught a group of his former board members how to salsa. He saw his once stoic assistant, now the head of the Silva Foundation, laughing with Lena's cousins. He saw a community being born, a family being forged not from blood or business, but from mutual respect and later that evening, as the party continued to buzz around them, Julian pulled Lena away to the quiet of the coffee shop's new rooftop garden, a space she had designed herself. The city glittered below them. "Happy Mrs. Vance," he whispered, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Happier than I ever thought possible, she murmured, leaning back against his chest. But you're going to have to get used to it. I'm keeping my own name for the business. Lena's Corner has a better ring to it than Mrs. Vance's Corner. He chuckled, resting his chin on her shoulder. I wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Silva. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city they were, in their own small way, helping to reshape. You know, Lena said thoughtfully, my dad always used to say that the best coffee has a little bitterness to it. It's what makes the sweetness stand out. Julian smiled. I think he was right. We had our bitterness. Yes, she said, turning in his arms to face him. But look at how sweet it is now. He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had started it all, the eyes that held his entire world. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the promise of countless sunrises, shared cups of coffee, and a lifetime of building something real together. Their story hadn't started like a fairy tale. It had started with a desperate lie in a cold boardroom, but it had ended here, under the stars, with a love that was more honest and more powerful than any empire. It was a legacy of their own making, and it was just the beginning. What did you think of Julian and Lena's journey from a fake engagement to a true partnership? On a scale of lean to Shiu, what score would you give this story? Let us know in the comments below. And for everyone who stayed with us until the very end, who believed in second chances and the power of a good cup of coffee, please comment at ucafe.com to let us know you made it. We love reading all your thoughts. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.